You know, a marking gauge may seem like a fairly simple tool. I mean, it's mostly just a fence, a beam, and a pin or a knife of some kind. And there are a lot of different styles out there, anything from the metal versions sold by companies like Tightmark and Veritas, wooden ones with little screw adjusters like the common ones sold by Crown or Marples, Japanese versions with knives and wedges. My favorite is actually a French style gauge. This gauge was probably popularized recently, most recently anyway, by an article in Popular Woodworking done a few years ago by Dean Jansa. He wrote an article about building gauges like these based on ones that were in the tool chest of Benjamin Seaton. These gauges are based on a French design in which the wedge travels perpendicular to the arm, as opposed to the more common design that was seen in England, where the wedge traveled parallel to the arm through the stock. The French style is a little bit more challenging to build, but I think it's a much nicer gauge, a much easier gauge to use, and just an overall better design. So that's the style we're going to build today. Now, I've got several of these gauges that I've built that I use for different purposes. I have two here that are made with a knife style pin, and I have another one that I built that actually has fixed pins that are set to the width of my mortising chisels. This way I don't have to worry about adjusting the pins like on a gauge like this. And I can still keep this one around for projects like the gauge we're going to be working on today, because I don't have a 5/8 inch mortise chisel, and that's the size of one of the mortises that we're going to be working with. But you know, on occasion I need mortises of different size, or I need to use the gauge for something else. So I do keep one of these sliding pin styles around, but really for most of my joinery work I'm using a fixed pin mortise gauge like this. So what I want to do, and these are great projects to use up some of those offcuts from your scrap bin, so you know, don't go throwing all these out, especially if you've got a couple of figured pieces. Figured wood makes really nice tools. So I'm going to start out with a piece of wood, and I'm going to estimate this is somewhere around 1 3/4 inches, yeah, probably closer to 2 inches wide. Let's see, yeah, so it's about 2 inches wide, by about anywhere from 1 inch to 1 1.25 inches thick. And then the length of this, I'm going to say, is probably somewhere around about 3 inches. So I'm going to start out by just laying out all the joinery that I need. So I've gone and I've laid out the dimensions on an oversized block. I like to leave this extra length down here because it allows me to hold it better in the vise or knock it down with a holdfast. So I've got a piece that's about 3 inches long by about 2 inches wide by about 1 inch to 1 1.25 inches thick. I've laid out for a 5/8 inch mortise on both sides, okay, both sides of the stock, and I've also laid out the center of that mortise. This mortise is centered on the stock's width and about 5/8 to 3/4 inch up from the bottom. This is the bottom section here. This is the top part here where we're going to eventually round this over. On the other side, you can see I've also transferred that mortise around. You can see in red here I've laid out how the wedge is going to intersect. So what I've got here is a wedge that runs parallel here to the top of the mortise, and that wedge mortise is going to be at about a 6-degree angle at the top, and you can see I've marked that in red here. On the side, I've laid out here for the wide part of the mortise, and on the other side I've laid out for the narrow part of the mortise. And I'm going to start my joinery with the mortise for the beam on this side. So I'm going to start by boring out the majority of the waste for the mortise. Now, since my mortise is 5/8 inches, I'm boring a hole slightly undersized. So I'm using a number 9 auger bit, which corresponds to about 9/16 of an inch. And I'm boring through an equal amount from both sides. Now I'll take a 5/8 inch chisel and go ahead and chop out the remainder of the waste and square up the mortise. After chopping the majority of the waste, I just clean up the sides with a couple paring cuts. And it doesn't matter if this is a little bit off of 5/8 or not perfectly square, because we're going to make the arm to fit the mortise, so it doesn't have to be perfect. And here's a little tip before you get cranking on the wedge mortise. Make yourself a little filler piece out of some pine or some softwood that fits tightly inside that mortise, and fit it in there before you start boring and chopping the wedge mortise. And this is going to keep the inside of the arm mortise from blowing out as the auger bit and chisel start chopping through into that space where the arm mortise is going to be. Just keeps everything nice and clean on the inside and keeps it from all chipping out. Now again, I'm going to start this mortise by boring with an auger bit. And this time I'm going to try and follow the angle somewhat. Doesn't have to be perfect because it's going to be wedge shaped when it's done. So if it's a little bit off, that's okay. We can correct it with the chisel. Again, I'm going to try and bore halfway through from each side and meet in the middle. And I can see shavings coming up there from the pine, so I know that I'm about halfway through. So I'll flip it over and bore the rest of the way through from the other side. Now as I chop this mortise, I start out by trying to do as much as I can with the mortise chisel. However, because of how tight the mortise is, I'm not going to be able to finish it with the thick mortise chisel. The chisel itself is just too thick, so I'm going to have to finish it up with a regular bench chisel. But the mortise chisel allows me to get as much of it roughed out as I can before I switch over to the bench chisel for the final cleanup cuts. And I'm trying to sight that angle that I drew and keep my chisel at that angle while I chop. Again, the angle doesn't have to be perfect, just get it close because we'll adjust the wedge to fit it later. Now one little trick that you can do to see if your mortise is done is to put your chisel in and see if it rocks. And you can see here how my chisel rocks a little bit. That means there's a hump in the middle, so I want to make sure I pare that out, get that flat before I continue. And I'll do that on both sides just to check. Now once the mortises are all done, then I'm going to rip a piece of stock and plane it and square it up and start to fit it to the mortises. Now make this piece extra long because the ends tend to get dinged up or they dip a little bit. And I'm just going to work it until I can get it nicely fit to the mortise. Okay, that's what I want. It fits in and it has no slop. And in some spots I have to push it a little hard. But that's what I want right now. Is a tight fit with no slop. The next thing I can work on is the wedge to hold the arm in place. Now, what I've done here is just to cut the general outline of the wedge, but I've cut it much thicker than I need. So, just like I did with the arm, I'm going to go ahead and plane it down until it fits the wedge mortise. That looks pretty good. Now I need to trim down this part here a little bit because it won't quite fit through this side of the mortise just yet. So I'm just going to take a gouge and just pare this shape down a little bit. Okay, there we go. And this is just really a lot of trial and error until you get it to fit. Now the last thing I want to do with this wedge is, if you can see right now, I don't know if you can see it here, but the wedge sticks down a little bit below the wedge mortise. Well, that's where we want it to be when it's applying pressure to the arm. But for now, we need it to be able to sit up higher so that the arm can slide. So I'm just going to take a plane and I'm going to very carefully plane the bottom by pulling the wedge along it so that I can fit that wedge up just a little bit higher so that it clears the arm when it's in the loose position. Almost there. Okay, one last test fit. I think this should probably do it. See if the arm fits in there. There we go. So the arm slides through, and if we put some pressure on the wedge, it locks everything down nice and tight. Last thing to do is cut it free and do the final shaping. So what if you don't want to go through the trouble of chopping a little wedge mortise for the captured wedge to tighten your gauge? Well, there's another neat way that we can go about this that just uses an angled hole bored through the stock. So let me show you how we go about doing that instead. So instead of the typical captured wedge, we can just use a piece of dowel stock instead. And the trick to this is to bore an angled hole that intersects your mortise instead of chopping the wedge mortise. So you can see here that the angle that that dowel is bored at, that hole is bored at, if I put the dowel in. And what you'll see on the inside here is that the dowel just slightly intersects the wedge mortise, the mortise for the arm, sorry. Okay, so hopefully you can see that here, how the dowel on the inside there just barely intersects the mortise when we put the dowel in. So that is what's going to give us the wedging pressure. But in order to do it right and do it clean, we're going to cut a little recess in the dowel. So I start by making the dowel oversized. And I'm going to put it in to the wedge mortise, and I'm going to use a pencil and I want to trace the inside of the mortise on the dowel, both sides. And what I'm doing is I'm transferring that angle. I'm also going to trace just this side here, basically tracing the hole. Okay, I don't know if you can see that. I'll do it again on this side. Just tracing that hole there. Now let me pull the dowel out and show you what we end up with. So it looks kind of sloppy there, but in essence what you have is the shape of the wedge mortise. Sorry, not the wedge mortise, the intersection of the arm mortise. So now I'm going to take a chisel and I'm going to relieve that area. I've just paired a nice long shallow taper so you can see sort of what that looks like. Okay, so now instead of the wedge we can use this dowel with the notch in it, and we put the dowel in there and we line it up. And when you first insert it in, you'll notice that it's flat and recessed. So you can insert the arm and then push it up, leaves it loose so that I can slide the arm. But if I push it from this side, tightens everything up nice and tight. So there's a way that you can, a faster way. I like to use this method when I'm making a hole bunch like I'm doing here, because I can just set up and drill these angled holes right down the line and then use a dowel stock and make myself a whole bunch of wedges. So the curve of the top edge gets shaped before I cut it free, and I start that after laying out the curve just by knocking off the corners. Next I put the stock in a vise and just fair the curve with a spoke shave. And I'll just finish smoothing everything up after the spoke shave with a nice fine file. Now I can cut the head free from the rest of the block. So now's the time to decide how you want to finish this off. I cut a small bevel or angle on this side. It just makes the gauge a little bit more comfortable to use, I think, and it lets you adjust it easily with one hand. This is how the plan in the Popular Woodworking article was originally done, so I sort of followed that the first time I built the gauge, and I liked it the way it was, so I keep building them that way. There are examples of French gauges that just leave the stock square like this, so if you don't want the angle, you don't need to worry about it. You also need to decide which way you want the wedge to work. I like my wedge to work so that it tightens when I push it with my thumb. You can also have it set up so that it tightens when you pull it with your forefinger. Really just personal preference. There's no right or wrong here. But what you want to do is decide how you want this set up. If you are going to cut this bevel here, decide, if you're left-handed or right-handed, decide which way you want to use the gauge. So if you're right-handed and you want to use the gauge so that it tightens by pushing with your thumb, make sure you align the thicker edge of the wedge towards your thumb and cut the bevel on the side to the right. If you're left-handed and you want to be able to push with your thumb, obviously you're going to line the thick side of the wedge up so that you can use your thumb and cut the bevel to the left side. And just the opposite, if you want to pull, same type of deal. You know, put the wedge in the orientation that you want it in the final gauge and cut that bevel on whatever side your dominant hand is. I'm making this for a right-handed person, and for using by tightening the wedge with the thumb. So I'm going to orient the wedge so that it's on the side closest to me, and I'm going to cut the bevel on this side. And a few swipes of the smooth plane just to clean it up. Finish up the head with a couple swipes of the plane just to clean everything up. I'll cut the arm to length. I usually make these somewhere in the neighborhood of about 8 inches. I find that's comfortable. Make them longer or shorter, whatever you feel is appropriate for your own gauge. There's no right or wrong here. And I just bevel the ends with a chisel. Now for making the pin or knife for the marking gauge, I use 5/64 inch round 01 tool steel. If you don't want to buy a whole big length of this was about 3 feet I think when I started out. You can just use, you know, a piece of a broken drill bit or whatever. The other thing with the tool steel is if you choose to go this route, you're going to need to harden this. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself sharpening it an awful lot. So if you're not comfortable hardening tool steel, and I'll show you how to do that, but if you're not comfortable heat treating tool steel and hardening it, you may want to just go with, you know, a piece of high-speed steel, broken drill bit or something like that instead. Or you can even use a finishing nail. You just have to sharpen it a little bit more often. This I got from McMaster Carr in an order. I was placing an order for some saw steel as well, so I just threw this in. I think it was like $2 maybe for about 3 feet of it, so it's more than enough that I'll ever need to make plenty of gauges. So what I'm going to do with this is file a little knife edge on the end of this round tool steel before I harden it. So I've clamped the piece of tool steel between 2 pieces of wood to the top of my bench just to mobilize it while I file. And I'm just going to use an auger bit file because it has a safe edge. And I'm going to go ahead and file a flat right on the very tip of that piece of steel. So what you can see here is how I've got this flat on the front section now that's about half the thickness, maybe a little less than half the thickness through the steel. So I'm going to take it out now of the clamp, and I'm going to round this squared up tip here. I'm going to round that over into sort of a half circle ellipse type shape. Okay, so you can see the rounded shape that I've given that tip now, but it's still, if I turn it here, you can see it's still sort of thick. So I'm going to take the back of it now, and I'm going to file the back, sort of round it into that flat face that I filed before to make sort of a football shape, and turn that tip up here, that rounded tip, into a knife edge. So I'm just going to continue to use the file and sort of round that back over this way until I have a rounded knife edge on the front. Okay, so you can see now how this is sort of a more rounded football shape, and it forms a knife edge on that rounded tip. And that's really the trick here, is to keep that tip rounded. Don't form a point at the top, but keep that knife edge rounded, and that's what makes the gauge cut smoothly and not hang up or tear grain, is that rounded knife edge. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is heat treat that piece of steel. So I just use a little pair of snips and I cut it to size. Let's talk just for a second about safety. I know it should be common sense, but I think it bears saying once, repeating, etc. Heat treating can be extremely dangerous. You're talking about using, one, an open flame, and two, a flammable material such as some kind of oil. I'm using used motor oil here, but you can use peanut oil or vegetable oil or any kind of oil as your quench medium for O1 steel. But regardless of what you use, make sure you clean up your bench area first. You don't want any stray shavings catching fire, drifting off somewhere else in the shop. Better yet, do it outside where there's nothing around that can burn. Do it in your garage, do it in your backyard, do it someplace else outside of your shop if you can, where there's nothing that's going to burn. I usually do this out in my garage. I'm bringing the stuff in here tonight just so I can film it, but I've gone and I've cleaned up all the wood from around my immediate bench area here so that I don't take the chance of setting something on fire. And of course, it goes without saying, but keep a fire extinguisher close by just in case. Make sure you're prepared for the unexpected. So what you're going to need to heat treat this tiny little piece of steel is nothing more than a propane torch. You can use MAP gas. You can probably use your kitchen stove if you have a gas stove, or even a charcoal grill. And you're also going to need some type of oil to quench it in. I just have an old coffee can here that I have used motor oil in, and that's what I'm going to use as my quench medium. Now you don't need a high flame for this. All I'm doing is moving that tool steel in the hottest part, the tip of that flame, and I'm looking for when that color gets to be like an orange-red color. And there it is right there. And I want to hold it at that temperature just for a few seconds, and then plunge it right into the oil to cool it down as quickly as possible. You'll see there's a little bit of smoke, and it'll probably stink a little bit. Turn my torch off, wipe everything down. Now, be careful because it's probably still hot. But if you want to test it to see if it's hardened or not, you can take a file and try and file that steel. And if the file just skates across the steel and doesn't cut it, and you can see this file isn't cutting, it's taking the charring off, but it's not actually cutting the steel, that steel is hardened. So I just give the pin a little hone on my fine India stone. Wipe the burr off the rounded side until I have a decent little edge on there. That's good enough for a marking gauge. Now we can go drill the hole in the arm and insert the pin. So now I can just take a pair of pliers and slowly feed the pin down. Until I have it right where I want it. And then turn it so that the bevel faces the direction that you want. Now, which direction you face the bevel or the flat of the knife is totally up to you. I typically face the flat of the knife to the outside of the stock, but really what you're looking to do is keep the bevel side of the pin to the waste side of the line. That way the flat side of the pin cuts a nice flat-sided scribe. So there you go, a very simple but very useful tool. I always have several on the bench when I'm working on a project. You can see that this one ended up getting cut down a little shorter. What ended up happening is my original arm had a split in it that I didn't notice. It was sort of a hidden split until I went and bored that hole for the pin, and then the whole thing just split in half on me. So I took the offcut and just made a little short gauge for now. This will be good for gauging thickness of boards or dovetail baselines or something like that. You know, I got a couple inches of adjustment there, but I will go ahead and eventually make a new arm for it. So as for finish, totally up to you. I typically just like an oil and wax finish for tool handles. Some folks like varnish, some like shellac. Again, totally up to you. So I hope you'll make a few for yourself. They're really, really useful tools and a lot of fun to build.